I used to believe that if you worked hard enough, kept your head down, and did everything right, the world would eventually reward you. But then I got a job in a company run by rich people who saw my effort as entertainment, something to laugh at over wine with their elite friends. In today's story, I'm going to tell you how my wealthy boss and his polished, arrogant circle of friends bullied me for being poor, treated me like I was beneath them, and how, step by step, I learned their game so well that I ended up taking over the very company they thought I didn't deserve to work for. If you enjoy long, emotional revenge stories about rich versus poor, toxic workplaces, and justice served slowly and intelligently, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me until the very end. Because the way this story flips is exactly what they never expected, but what I quietly prepared for. My name is Anna, and I'm the kind of person rich people like to use as an example when they want to sound inspirational. You know the story. The girl from the poor neighborhood who somehow makes it into the big world of business, still wearing budget shoes and second-hand blazers. I grew up in a small apartment with cracked walls and thin doors that didn't block out the sound of neighbors arguing. My mother cleaned offices at night. My father, when he was still around, did small informal jobs, construction, deliveries, anything he could find, until he disappeared from our lives altogether. We didn't have much, but my mother had one rule she repeated like a prayer: study. Learn. Make your mind so strong that no one can take it away from you. So I did. I studied while helping her clean. I studied in noisy rooms. I studied when I was tired, when I was hungry, when I felt I would never fit anywhere. Eventually, I graduated in business administration, with grades that impressed teachers who had never bothered to learn my last name. When I got an interview at one of the most respected companies in the city, it felt like a miracle. It was also the beginning of a very specific kind of hell. The company, which I'll call Valenka and Partners, occupied the top floors of a glass building in the richest part of town. The lobby alone screamed money. Marble floors, a front desk that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel, and people in suits that cost more than my monthly rent. When I stepped out of the elevator on my first day, holding my cheap handbag and wearing my carefully ironed but modest outfit, I felt like an intruder. My boss, Marcelo, met me in his office with a broad plastic smile. He was in his early 40s, with perfectly styled hair and a watch that glinted every time he moved his hand. His family had founded the company decades ago, and to him, it was less a job and more a throne. "Welcome, Anna," he said, looking at my resume again as if he hadn't already read it. "You have an impressive academic record for your background." That last part was not in the resume. It was in my accent, my clothes, my nervous posture. I told myself to ignore it. I needed the job, I needed the salary, I needed the opportunity. What I didn't know was that in their world, need is weakness and weakness is something they feed on. Marcelo had a group of friends who were always around the company, even if they technically didn't work there. Some were board members, some were investors, some were just rich men who liked to sit in glass offices and talk about money like it was a hobby. They were all the same type. Expensive suits, confident posture, teeth too white, laughs too loud. They shook hands firmly, called each other by nicknames, and treated everyone outside their circle like part of the decoration. The first time I met them was at a company event, a cocktail party, to celebrate a successful quarter. I had been working long hours on a report that helped secure one of the deals they were celebrating, but my presence there was more as a servant than a contributor. I walked around with a tray of documents Marcelo wanted to have ready just in case, while waiters in white shirts circulated with champagne and canapes. At one point, Marcelo called me over as he stood with 3 of his friends near the big window overlooking the city. "This is Anna," he said. "She's one of our brightest new analysts. Comes from the other side of town. Real success story." One of the men, I remember his name was Gustavo, looked at me with a smirk. "From the other side, huh?" he said. "Which side exactly?" "The one with bullet holes in the walls." They all laughed, even Marcelo. I forced a smile that hurt my face. Another friend, Ricardo, tilted his head and added, "Well, at least now you have a view of the city from up here, instead of from the bus stop." They laughed again. I laughed a little too, out of reflex, then hated myself for it later. To them, it was harmless. To me, it was the beginning. It didn't stop at jokes. They started making comments about everything. My clothes. "Did you get that blazer at a charity sale?" My lunch. "Ah, bringing food from home, cute. We should take you to a real restaurant one day." My neighborhood, is your street on Google Maps, or do you need a guide to get home safely? Sometimes, Marcelo would ask me to stay late to help prepare presentations for meetings he had with those same friends. I would organize data, build slides, double-check numbers. While they joked in the next room about the kind of people who worked too hard because they don't have any real options in life. Once, when I accidentally walked into the break room while they were talking, I heard Gustavo say, "Marcelo, you're a saint. Giving these people jobs, it must feel like doing charity every day." They all laughed, and Marcelo replied, "Well, they're cheap and grateful. It balances out. They didn't know I was there. I don't think they have cared." The breaking point came during a team-building retreat the company organized at a luxury resort. Of course, when they said team, they really meant management and their favorites. Most of the actual workers stayed behind. I was invited because Marcelo wanted someone to handle all the documentation, notes, and follow-up tasks. In other words, I was going as a glorified assistant. At dinner the first night, everyone was wearing designer clothes, talking about their last vacations in Europe, exchanging stories about the markets like it was a sport. I sat near the end of the table, trying to blend in as much as someone like me could in a place like that. The conversation turned to social responsibility, how their company was helping poor communities through donations and programs that, from what I'd seen internally, were mostly for marketing. Gustavo raised his glass and said, "We should ask Anna here. She's our resident expert on the poor experience, right?" The table chuckled. Marcelo smirked and added, "True? Anna, tell us, how does it feel to be the only one here who really climbed from the bottom? You must feel overwhelmed." Everyone turned to look at me, waiting for me to either laugh or shrink. I felt my heart beating in my ears. A hot wave of shame and anger rose in my chest. But instead of exploding, I felt something else settle in, a cold, focused clarity. I smiled, just a little. "It feels like being in a zoo," I said calmly, "except I'm not sure if I'm the animal or the one taking notes on strange behavior." There was an awkward pause. A couple of people choked on their drinks, half laughing, half shocked. Marcelo's eyes hardened for a second, but he laughed it off, making some joke to move the conversation along. But in that moment, something inside me changed. I knew these people would never respect me. Not really. To them, I was a punching bag with a degree, so I decided I wouldn't waste my energy trying to earn what they would never give. Instead, I would take something they never imagined I could have, their power. From that point on, I stopped trying to fit in and started trying to understand everything. I learned every system, every process, every client account I could get near. I volunteered for projects no one else wanted because they were too boring or too messy. I stayed late not to impress them, but to quietly collect knowledge and influence. I became the person everyone in the lower and middle levels went to when they had a problem. Not Marcelo, not his rich friends. Me. I listened to frustrations, took note of inefficiencies, and slowly became the unofficial link between the people who actually did the work and the people who took credit for it. At the same time, I started to understand something crucial. Marcelo and his elite friends were not actually good at running the company. They were good at networking, at looking confident in meetings, at throwing around buzzwords. But when it came to operations, numbers, and people, they were clumsy and careless. They made risky decisions based on ego, not data. They ignored warnings because they believed they were too smart to fail. They dismissed concerns from lower levels as noise. That kind of arrogance is a slow poison. You just have to let it work. The turning point came when one of Marcelo's brilliant ideas backfired. He had convinced the board to invest heavily in a new client, a flashy startup led by yet another rich friend of theirs. On paper, the numbers looked impressive. But when I went through the deeper financials and market research, I saw red flags everywhere. I brought it up to Marcelo in a meeting, showing him data, projections, and potential risks. He barely glanced at the report. "Anna, you're good with numbers, but you don't understand vision," he said, in front of others. "These people are innovators. We need to be aligned with that kind of success. Leave the big picture to us, okay?" So I did what I had learned to do. I documented everything. I saved my report. I saved his dismissive email. I kept records of the dates, the warnings, the decisions. 6 months later, the innovative startup imploded under accusations of fraud, mismanagement, and inflated results. Its collapse dragged our company down with it, at least on the surface. Clients panicked. Investors started calling. The media raised questions. Inside the company, chaos spread like fire. Marcelo and his friends scrambled to find someone to blame. For a moment, they tried to push it down to execution errors and unforeseen market shifts, but the paper trail didn't lie. The board demanded explanations. Real ones. One of the older board members, a man who had always been more observant than talkative, called me into a private meeting. He had seen my name attached to reports, presentations, and internal memos for months. He had noticed that whenever there was a mess, my fingerprints were also nearby, not as the cause, but as the one trying to prevent it. He asked me, very calmly, "Tell me exactly what you knew about that deal." And when you knew it, I showed him everything. The reports, the ignored warnings, the dismissive messages from Marcelo. I didn't have to embellish anything. The facts were enough. He listened in silence, then leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Do you realize how valuable you are to this company, Anna?" he asked. "No one at the top seems to have noticed, but I have." In the weeks that followed, I was pulled into more and more high-level meetings. Not as decoration, not as a note-taker, but as someone whose analysis actually mattered. Some board members started asking for my opinion before they asked for Marcelo's. Others began to see him the way I had always seen him, as a charismatic face on a foundation of sand. The more desperate things got, the more they had to rely on the people who actually understood the business, people like me. The board eventually reached a decision. Marcelo, along with two of his closest elite friends tied to the company, would step down from executive control. Officially, it was to protect the company's image and facilitate restructuring. Unofficially, it was because they were incompetent, arrogant, and now too risky to keep in charge. When the announcement came, Marcelo's face was a mix of shock, humiliation, and barely contained rage. He looked around the meeting room as if hoping someone would stand up and say it was all a mistake. No one did. He looked at me for a brief second, just enough for me to see that he finally understood something he had refused to see before. The girl from the other side of town was still standing. While he was falling, the board didn't hand me his position immediately. That wouldn't have been realistic. But they did something almost as powerful. They put me in charge of a major restructuring project and gave me authority he had never wanted me to have. Bit by bit, responsibility by responsibility, I became the central axis of the company's operations. Over the next year, as things stabilized, my role grew. My title changed. My salary increased. My voice in meetings no longer went over other people's heads, it redirected them. And then, one day, the board made it official. They offered me the role of operations director, with a clear path to eventually become CEO. The girl they laughed at for taking the bus was now leading the company they treated like a private toy. I didn't throw a party in Marcelo's face. I didn't send him a message saying, "Look at me now." I didn't need to. He saw the press release. He saw the internal announcements. He saw my name where his used to be. One afternoon, he came by the office to pick up some documents and say hello to old colleagues. It was the first time we had seen each other since his fall. He walked past my new office, did a double take when he saw my name on the glass, and then forced himself to step inside. "Congratulations," he said stiffly. "I see you've done well." I smiled politely. "Thank you. We've been working hard to repair the damage from that period." He flinched just a little. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the air heavy with everything that had happened. The jokes, the humiliation, the underestimation, and the reversal neither of us could have predicted years ago. He eventually turned and left. I went back to my work. My revenge wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a speech in front of everyone. My revenge was simple, sitting in the chair he once believed I'd never even be allowed to touch. Sometimes people ask me if I forgave him. If I forgave them, Marcelo, Gustavo, Ricardo, all of them. The truth is, I stopped caring about their apologies a long time ago. I didn't climb just to prove something to them. I climbed because my mother's voice was always in my head, telling me to make my mind strong, to go as far as I could, not for revenge, but for myself. The fact that my success turned into their punishment, that was just karma doing its job. They wanted me to be grateful for being in their world. Now, it's their world that depends on people like me to keep it standing. I was never beneath them. I was just earlier in my story. And in the end, the people who laughed at my beginnings had to watch me write my own ending from the top. If you've ever been humiliated at work for where you come from, what you wear, or how much money you have, tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Would you have quit, confronted them, or stayed quiet and waited for the right moment, like I did. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to remember that being underestimated can be a weapon, if you know how to use it. And if you want more long emotional revenge stories about rich versus poor, toxic workplaces, and slow, intelligent justice, stay tuned. Season 1 still has many stories to tell.